She had seen thousands of passengers board flights over her 12 years as a senior flight attendant. But something about the tall black man in seat 23B made her jaw tighten that Tuesday morning. He wore a simple gray hoodie and jeans, carrying a worn backpack that had seen better days, the kind that suggested frequent travel and practical use rather than fashion. When he politely asked for a glass of water before takeoff, his voice calm and courteous, she told him to wait until they were airborne. Her tone was clipped, dismissive, carrying an edge that suggested his request was an imposition rather than a simple need. He nodded quietly, accepting her response without protest, and turned back to his book, a thick hardcover about aviation safety regulations that most passengers would never choose as light reading material. Several passengers nearby had noticed the exchange in the tone with which it was delivered. The woman in 23A frowned deeply, her expression troubled. The businessman across the aisle looked uncomfortable, shifting in his seat and glancing between the flight attendant and the man she had just dismissed so curtly. What none of them knew, what none of them could possibly have imagined in that moment, was that this seemingly ordinary passenger would soon walk through that cockpit door. And when he did, everything this flight attendant thought she knew about her job, her judgment, and herself would shatter in an instant that would reverberate through her entire career and beyond. Before we continue with what happened next, we want to know where you're watching from. Are you in New York, Los Angeles, London, Manchester, or somewhere else entirely? Drop your city in the comments, because this story is resonating with people all across the United States and the United Kingdom, and we want to see how far this message spreads. Now, let's get back to what unfolded at 30,000 feet, where the air is thin but the tensions were about to become unbearably thick. The flight was Delta 1847, departing from Atlanta's Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport bound for Seattle-Tacoma International, a 5-hour journey across the continental United States. It was a routine Tuesday morning flight, the kind that flight attendants like Sarah Mitchell had worked hundreds of times before without incident or drama. Sarah was 41 years old, impeccably dressed in her crisp Navy uniform that she pressed herself every evening before her shifts, her blonde hair pulled back in a regulation bun that she secured with exactly 17 bobby pins, the same number every single day. She prided herself on maintaining standards that she felt were slipping in the modern airline industry, on knowing her aircraft inside and out from every emergency exit to every equipment locker, on running a tight ship in her section of the cabin, where nothing escaped her notice, and everything operated according to her precise expectations. She had commendations from the airline hanging framed in her apartment, glowing passenger reviews that praise her attentiveness and professionalism, and a spotless record that she mentioned frequently to newer crew members as an example of what real dedication looked like. She considered herself professional, efficient, and above all, fair in her treatment of passengers, though her definition of fairness was filtered through lenses she had never examined, biases she had never questioned, assumptions she had never challenged because they felt like common sense rather than prejudice. Marcus Thompson settled into his seat that morning without any expectation of trouble, though he carried with him the learned wariness that comes from a lifetime of navigating spaces where your presence is questioned before your humanity is acknowledged. At 36, he had long ago learned to navigate the subtle and not-so-subtle biases that came with being a black man in predominantly white spaces, the constant low-level vigilance required to anticipate reactions and prepare responses. He had experienced the lingering glances in department stores where security guards materialized in whichever aisle he browsed, following at a distance they thought was discreet. He had experienced the locked car doors in parking lots when he walked past families loading groceries, heard the decisive click of central locking systems activated by parents who pulled their children closer. He had experienced the surprise in people's voices when he spoke with his Yale education evident in his vocabulary, the subtle recalibration happening behind their eyes as they adjusted their assumptions. He had learned when to speak up and when to let things slide, when to demand dignity, and when to conserve his energy for battles that mattered more. The flight attendant's curt response to his simple request for water was, in his experience, not worth making an issue over, not worth the confrontation, not worth being labeled as difficult or aggressive or any of the other adjectives that follow black men who dare to assert themselves. He had a book to read, work emails to catch up on before his meetings in Seattle, and a long day ahead that would require his full focus and energy. He chose peace, as he so often did, saving his strength for when it truly counted. But Sarah's behavior throughout the boarding process told a different story to anyone paying attention. Anyone watching with eyes trained to see the patterns that repeat themselves across countless interactions in countless spaces. When an elderly white woman 2 rows ahead asked for help lifting her bag into the overhead compartment, struggling with a suitcase that was clearly too heavy for her to manage alone, Sarah rushed over with a warm smile that transformed her face, offering assistance immediately and asking if there was anything else she could do to make her flight comfortable, perhaps a pillow or a blanket or help finding a magazine. When a young white businessman in an expensive suit asked if he could move to an empty seat in an exit row for more legroom because he had a bad back, she personally checked availability on her tablet, confirmed the seat was available, and escorted him to the better seat herself, chatting pleasantly about his destination and wishing him a productive business trip. When a white family with young children boarded looking frazzled and overwhelmed, the parents juggling car seats and diaper bags and trying to keep their toddlers from running down the aisle, she went out of her way to find extra pillows and blankets without being asked, speaking to the parents with patience and understanding, even offering to warm a bottle when the time came and suggesting the mother might find the galley area more comfortable for nursing if needed. Marcus noticed these interactions because noticing had become second nature, an automatic cataloging system that tracked differential treatment the way a scientist tracks experimental data. He didn't comment, didn't react visibly, didn't let his face betray the weary recognition of a pattern he'd seen hundreds of times before in hundreds of different contexts. But he noticed. When he asked if the Wi-Fi was working properly because his connection kept dropping and he needed to access some files before landing, Sarah barely glanced his way before saying she didn't handle technical issues, and he'd have to figure out himself, her tone suggesting that his question was an annoying interruption to her more important tasks. When his tray table wouldn't lock properly, and he mentioned it might be a safety concern because it kept falling down and could become dangerous during turbulence, she sighed heavily with obvious exasperation, examined it for perhaps 2 seconds without really testing the mechanism, said it was fine in a voice that closed off further discussion, and walked away before he could explain the actual problem. When he requested a beverage during the service, she set it down without making eye contact, without the smile she had offered to every other passenger's row, and moved on immediately to the next row where she engaged in friendly conversation about vacation plans with a white couple celebrating their anniversary. The passenger in 23A, an older white woman named Patricia Henderson, had been watching the differential treatment with growing discomfort that evolved into anger as the flight progressed. Patricia was a retired schoolteacher from Portland, a woman who had marched in civil rights rallies in her youth during the 1960s, who had been arrested twice for sitting in at segregated lunch counters, and who had spent her 35-year career trying to create equitable environments for all her students regardless of their backgrounds. She recognized what was happening because she had trained herself to see it, had spent decades educating herself about systemic racism and implicit bias, had done the uncomfortable work of examining her own privileges and prejudices. After Sarah walked away from Marcus for the 3rd time with barely concealed irritation, while being warm and accommodating to white passengers making similar or even more demanding requests, Patricia leaned over slightly, careful to keep her voice low enough for privacy, but clear enough to convey sincerity. "I'm sorry you're experiencing this," she said quietly to Marcus, her eyes meeting his with genuine concern and recognition. "It's not right, and I've been watching her treat you completely differently than everyone else around us. I want you to know that I see it, and it's unacceptable." Marcus gave her a small, tired smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, the kind of smile that acknowledged her kindness, while also conveying the exhaustion of needing kindness in the first place. "I appreciate you noticing, ma'am. Unfortunately, it's not exactly uncommon in my experience. But thank you for saying something. It matters more than you might think when people actually acknowledge what's happening instead of pretending not to see it." Patricia wasn't satisfied with passive acknowledgement. "You should report her to the airline. I'd be happy to give a statement about what I've witnessed, everything from the moment you boarded. I've been taking notes on my phone with timestamps." "Maybe," Marcus said noncommittally, his tone gentle, but carrying the weight of someone who had been through this before and knew how these complaints often went nowhere despite promises of investigation. He returned to his book, hoping the flight would pass without further incident, hoping he could just disappear into his reading and arrive in Seattle without any more confrontations that would drain the energy needed for his work. But Sarah wasn't finished with him, wasn't done letting her biases dictate her actions and her interactions. About 2 hours into the flight, somewhere over Montana, as the plane cruised at 35,000 feet, with clear skies and smooth air, Marcus got up to use a lavatory. There was a short line, with 2 people ahead of him waiting patiently in the aisle near the rear of the cabin. He stood quietly, checking his phone while waiting his turn, scrolling through work emails and responding to a few questions from his office. Sarah emerged from the galley carrying a tray of empty cups, saw him standing in the aisle, and her expression immediately hardened into something that looked almost like fear mixed with indignation. "Sir, you need to return to your seat," she said sharply, her voice pitched loud enough that multiple passengers turned to look, creating exactly the kind of scene that would mark him as a problem passenger in their memories. Marcus looked up from his phone, genuinely confused by the command. "I'm waiting for the restroom. There are 2 people ahead of me in line. The seatbelt sign might come on at any moment with unexpected turbulence. Return to your seat now." Her voice had taken on an authoritative edge, the kind meant to intimidate and establish dominance, the kind that suggested non-compliance would result in consequences. "The seatbelt sign isn't on now," Marcus replied calmly, keeping his voice level and reasonable despite the spike of frustration rising in his chest. "And there are several other passengers standing and waiting as well." He gestured to people ahead of him in line and others who had stood to stretch their legs in the galley area, including a man chatting with another flight attendant near the forward bathroom. Sarah's face flushed red, a deep crimson that spread from her neck to her cheeks. "I won't ask again. Return to your seat immediately, or I'll have to report you for non-compliance with crew member instructions, which is a federal offense that could result in your arrest upon landing and placement on a no-fly list." The entire surrounding area of the cabin had gone quiet, that particular silence that falls when everyone is listening while pretending not to listen. Passengers stared openly now, no longer maintaining the polite fiction of minding their own business. The 2 people ahead of Marcus in line looked uncomfortable, uncertain whether to speak up or whether doing so would make things worse. The man directly in front of him, a white passenger in his 50s wearing a University of Washington sweatshirt, tried to help. "Ma'am, he's just waiting in line like the rest of us. He hasn't done anything wrong at all. I've been standing here longer than he has," the man said, his voice reasonable and supportive. Sarah's eyes flashed with something that might have been panic at having her authority questioned by another white passenger who should, in her mental framework, have been on her side. "Sir, I need you to stay out of this. This doesn't concern you, and I won't warn you again about interfering with crew duties. It concerns all of us when we're witnessing discrimination happening right in front of us," Patricia said loudly from her seat, standing up so Sarah could see her clearly across the rows. Several other passengers murmured in agreement, a rumbling of support that grew louder as more people recognized what was happening. Sarah's professional mask cracked slightly, revealing the uncertainty beneath her authoritative exterior. She hadn't expected witnesses to speak up so vocally, hadn't expected her authority to be questioned by multiple passengers, hadn't prepared for a scenario where her actions were being called out publicly. "This passenger has been problematic since boarding. I'm addressing a pattern of disruptive behavior that requires intervention." "What pattern?" Marcus asked, his voice still calm but with steel underneath, the controlled anger of someone who had reached their limit of tolerance for unjust treatment. "I asked for water before takeoff, and you told me to wait. I asked about Wi-Fi technical issues, and you dismissed me without trying to help. I mentioned a legitimate safety issue with my tray table, and you ignored it completely. I've been sitting quietly reading my book while you provided excellent, friendly service to everyone around me who doesn't happen to look like me. Now I'm standing in line to use a restroom like a dozen other passengers have done throughout this flight, without any comment from you, and suddenly I'm problematic? What exactly is the pattern of behavior you're referring to? Please be specific." Other passengers had started pulling out their phones, the distinctive gesture of raising devices to record becoming visible throughout the surrounding rows. In the age of social media and viral videos, Sarah suddenly realized the situation was spiraling beyond her control in ways that could have serious consequences. She had picked the wrong passenger, the wrong flight, The wrong moment to let her biases dictate her actions. The wrong audience to witness her discrimination. "I want to speak to the pilot," Marcus said clearly, his voice carrying authority of its own now. "I want to file a formal complaint about discriminatory treatment by a crew member, and I want witnesses' contact information for my report to the airline, and potentially to federal authorities." Sarah's laugh was sharp and condescending, almost a bark of disbelief. "The pilot is not going to see you. The cockpit is secured and restricted for security reasons. You need to return to your seat immediately before I have you restrained by other passengers if necessary and arrested upon landing for threatening behavior." Threatening? Patricia's voice cut through the cabin. Being black and waiting for the bathroom is threatening? Standing quietly in line is threatening? We all see exactly what's happening here, and we're not going to let you gaslight this man or any of us. A businessman across the aisle stood up, pulling a business card from his wallet. "I'm an attorney specializing in civil rights cases. I've been documenting this entire interaction from the beginning. Sir," he addressed Marcus directly, "I'm happy to provide a detailed statement and my professional witness testimony if this goes further legally, which I strongly encourage." A younger woman several rows back called out, her phone raised high. "I've been recording video for the past 10 minutes. This is absolutely discrimination and harassment, and everyone here can see it. This is going straight to social media if this airline doesn't handle this properly." Sarah looked around the cabin. At the sea of faces now turned toward her, many of them recording on their phones, many of them hostile to her treatment of this passenger, all of them witnesses to her actions. She had lost control of the situation entirely, had miscalculated badly, had assumed she could act on her biases without consequence or accountability. Her training told her to de-escalate, to bring in backup, to involve the flight deck if necessary, to step back and reassess. But her pride, her embarrassment of being called out so publicly, her defensive anger at having her authority challenged by passengers who should have simply complied and stayed quiet, all of it made her double down instead of backing down. "You need to sit down now, or I am declaring you a threat to the safety of this aircraft and its passengers," Sarah said, her voice shaking slightly as she reached for her radio to call for backup from other crew members. That was the moment the cockpit door opened with its distinctive mechanical click. Captain Jennifer Wall stepped into the cabin, her presence immediately commanding attention and shifting the entire dynamic of the confrontation. She was a striking woman in her late 40s, tall and confident with closely cropped natural hair and the bearing of someone who had commanded respect in difficult circumstances for decades. She was one of the first black female pilots to achieve the rank of captain at a major airline, having broken through barriers and overcome obstacles that would have stopped most people. She had heard raised voices from the cabin to the cockpit door, the sound penetrating even to the reinforced barriers, and during a calm portion of the flight, where her first officer could handle controls for a few minutes, she decided to see what was happening rather than ignore it or delegate entirely to cabin crew. She took in the scene immediately with the trained observational skills of someone who had to make rapid assessments in high-pressure situations. The tall black man standing calmly in the restroom line, his posture relaxed, but his face showing careful control. The red-faced flight attendant confronting him with aggressive body language. The phones recording from multiple angles. The other passengers standing in his defense rather than staying neutral. She had seen this movie before in various forms throughout her career. She had lived versions of this movie herself, had been the only black woman in countless cockpits and pilot lounges, had faced assumptions about her competence and her right to be there. She recognized the pattern instantly. What seems to be the problem here? Captain Walsh asked, her voice carrying the natural authority of someone who had commanded aircraft for 2 decades and wasn't accustomed to being questioned or ignored. Sarah spun around, relief washing over her features at seeing the captain, assuming automatic support from her superior. "Captain, thank goodness you're here. This passenger has been non-compliant and disruptive throughout the flight. I need your support in having him restrained for the remainder of the flight and arrested upon landing." Captain Walsh's eyes moved to Marcus, taking his calm demeanor and professional appearance, then swept across the other passengers, noting their body language and expressions. "Someone want to tell me what actually happened here? I want to hear from witnesses, not just crew." 5 people started talking at once, their voices overlapping in urgency to tell the truth before the official narrative could be set. Patricia spoke the loudest, her retired teacher's voice trained to project across noisy classrooms. "Captain, I've been sitting directly next to this gentleman for the entire flight, from boarding until now. He has been nothing but polite, quiet, and respectful. Your flight attendant has been treating him with open hostility and contempt from the moment he boarded this aircraft, while providing friendly, accommodating service to white passengers around him. He asked for water before takeoff, and she dismissed him rudely when she was getting water for others. He reported a legitimate safety issue with his tray table, and she brushed him off without properly checking it. He asked about Wi-Fi connectivity, and she told him to figure it out himself when she had helped others with similar questions. Now he's simply standing in line for the restroom like everyone else has done throughout this flight, and she's threatened to have him arrested and restrained. Multiple passengers have witnessed this clear pattern of discrimination, and several of us are willing and eager to provide official statements." The attorney spoke up, his voice carrying professional authority. "Captain, I'm David Rosen, a practicing civil rights attorney with 15 years of experience. I've observed a clear and documented pattern of differential treatment based solely on race. I'm prepared to provide testimony about everything I've witnessed, and I'm advising this passenger's rights to file complaints with the airline, the FAA, and potentially pursue legal action." The young woman with her phone raised called out, "I have video of the past 10 minutes, Captain. It's all recorded clearly with audio. Happy to share it with you, the airline, and the internet if necessary." Captain Walsh turned back to Sarah, and her expression was unreadable, carefully professional, but something in her eyes made Sarah take an involuntary step back. "Is this true?" the captain asked quietly, her tone making clear she expected a direct and honest answer. "No, there's been a misunderstanding. This passenger has been... I was just trying to maintain order and safety standards, and..." Sarah's words tumbled over each other, her certainty crumbling under the weight of multiple witnesses contradicting her narrative. "Were you treating him differently than other passengers?" Captain Walsh asked, her tone making clear she wanted a yes or no answer, not excuses or explanations. I don't think. I didn't intend any. There might have been..." Sarah stammered, unable to form a coherent defense. Marcus spoke up, his voice tired and carrying the weight of countless similar experiences. "Captain, I just want to use the restroom and get to Seattle without further incident. I'll be filing a formal complaint with the airline through proper channels. But right now, I'd just like this confrontation to be over so everyone can return to their day." Captain Walsh nodded slowly, processing everything she had heard and observed, already forming the report she would file. She turned to Marcus and asked, "What's your name, sir?" "Marcus Thompson." "Mr. Thompson, I apologize on behalf of this airline for the treatment you experienced on this flight. What happened here is completely unacceptable and goes against everything this airline claims to stand for. You have every right to file a complaint, and I'll be providing my own detailed report to support your account and the accounts of these witnesses. Sarah," she turned to the flight attendant, her voice dropping to a tone that left no room for argument, "return to galley immediately. I'll speak with you there privately. Another crew member will manage this section for the remainder of the flight." Sarah's face went white, the blood draining from her cheeks as she realized the severity of the situation. "Captain, I can explain everything if you just give me a chance to..." "Galley, now." There was no room for argument in Captain Walsh's voice, no possibility of negotiation or immediate explanation. As Sarah walked toward the rear of the aircraft, her shoulders hunched in shame and her confident stride reduced to an uncertain shuffle, Captain Walsh addressed the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the disturbance and for what you witnessed on this flight. Mr. Thompson, please use the restroom. Everyone else, thank you for speaking up when you witness something wrong. That takes courage and integrity, and it's how we create accountability." Marcus used the restroom quickly, grateful for a moment of privacy, to collect himself and process what had just happened. When he emerged, Captain Walsh was waiting in the galley area, having sent Sarah to the rear galley with another crew member supervising her to prevent any further incidents. The captain gestured for Marcus to join her near the cockpit, away from the main passenger cabin, where they could speak with some privacy. "Mr. Thompson, I want you to know that what happened here is completely unacceptable by any standard, and there will be serious consequences, Captain Walsh said, her voice firm and carrying conviction. I'm documenting everything in my official flight report, which becomes part of the permanent record. Marcus nodded, appreciating her directness. I appreciate that, Captain. Honestly, I'm just tired more than angry. This isn't the first time I've experienced differential treatment, and it probably won't be the last time either. It shouldn't happen at all, not even once, Captain Walsh said firmly. And certainly not on my aircraft or any aircraft. Can I ask what you do for a living, Mr. Thompson? You handle that situation with remarkable composure. Marcus gave a small, ironic smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. I'm an airline operations specialist. I work for the FAA, actually, in their safety and compliance division. I'm heading to Seattle to conduct a comprehensive safety audit at the regional office there. Captain Walsh's eyebrows rose in genuine surprise. You work for Federal Aviation Administration? For the past 8 years, yes. Before that, I was a pilot myself. Flew commercially for 5 years with regional carrier, private charter before that. I have my ADP license, about 4,000 flight hours logged across various aircraft types. He said it matter-of-factly, without pride or bitterness or any attempt to impress, just stating facts that will be verified as she chose to check. Captain Walsh was quiet for a long moment, processing this information and its implications. So your flight attendant just spent the last 3 hours treating a licensed pilot and federal aviation official like a criminal threat because of the color of his skin. Appears that way, Marcus agreed quietly, though I'm sure she'll say it had nothing to do with race when she gives her statement. Would you be willing to come into the cockpit for a moment? I'd like my first officer to hear this directly from you. And frankly, I think you've earned the right to see the flight deck of the aircraft you've been made so unwelcome in the cabin of. Marcus hesitated, uncomfortable with anything that felt like special treatment. Captain, I don't want special treatment or privileges. I just want to be treated equally with every other passenger on this plane. This isn't special treatment, Mr. Thompson. This is an FAA official being shown the professional courtesy that should have been extended from the beginning, but was denied to him as a passenger. This is me connecting you with another crew member who should know what happened on this flight. Please, I'm asking as one aviation professional to another. Marcus followed Captain Walsh into the cockpit, a space he hadn't entered as a visitor in years, the familiar layout bringing back memories of his flying days. The first officer, a man in his 30s named Robertson with an easy smile that faded quickly as the captain explained the situation, looked surprised to see a passenger entering the flight deck, but Captain Walsh quickly and efficiently explained what transpired in the cabin. Jesus Christ, Jim muttered when he heard the full story, his expression darkening with each detail. That's completely unacceptable and frankly embarrassing for all of us who wear this uniform. Mr. Thompson is an FAA operations specialist and an ADP-rated pilot, Captain Walsh added, providing context that made Chen's eyes widen further. Chen stood up from his seat to shake Marcus's hand properly, his grip firm and his expression genuinely apologetic. I'm very sorry you went through that, sir. That's not who we are as an airline, or at least, that's not who we're supposed to be. That's not the values we claim to represent. They talked for several minutes about Marcus's work with the FAA, about the specific focus of the Seattle audit he was conducting on maintenance procedures and safety protocols, about the current state of aviation safety oversight, and the challenges of balancing security with passenger experience. It was a professional conversation between colleagues who shared common knowledge and concerns, the kind of discussion Marcus should have been able to have from the moment he boarded if Sarah had bothered to see him as anything other than a stereotype to be managed and controlled. When Marcus returned to his seat after thanking both pilots for their professionalism and support, the atmosphere in the cabin had completely shifted from tense confrontation to something resembling solidarity and shared purpose. Patricia reached over and squeezed his hand warmly. "Good," she said simply, her eyes bright with emotion. "That captain has your back, and she's going to make sure this doesn't get swept under the rug." The attorney across the aisle leaned over with his business card, which identified him as a partner at a prominent civil rights law firm. "If you need any support with your complaint process, Mr. Thompson, please don't hesitate to contact me at any time." I meant what I said about providing a witness statement, and I'm happy to do so officially and under oath if necessary. Several other passengers approached throughout the remainder of the flight, offering their contact information, apologizing for what he had experienced, even though they bore no personal responsibility, expressing their disgust at Sarah's behavior and their pride in the captain's response. Marcus accepted their kindness with grace, though part of him wondered with bitter irony why it took a captain intervening, and the credentials being revealed for people to fully rally to his defense with such conviction. Shouldn't his humanity alone have been enough? Shouldn't being a person deserving of respect have been sufficient without needing to prove his professional status or education or achievements? Sarah remained in the rear galley for the rest of the flight, supervised by another crew member who had been briefed on the situation and instructed to prevent any further contact with passengers. Passengers who went to the rear lavatory reported that she looked like she'd been crying, her makeup smudged and running, her professional composure completely shattered, her careful presentation destroyed. Word spread to the cabin about who Marcus actually was, the information passing from row to row like wildfire, and the irony wasn't lost on anyone. The flight attendant who had treated him like a potential threat, like someone to be controlled and contained, had been dismissing and discriminating against someone who literally helped write and enforce the federal regulations she was supposed to follow in her job. As the plane began its descent into Seattle, the flight attendants preparing the cabin for landing and passengers putting away their laptops and books, Captain Walsh made an unusual announcement over the PA system that commanded immediate attention. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Walsh speaking. We're beginning our descent into Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, where the current weather is partly cloudy and 58 degrees. Before we land, I want to address something that happened on this flight that I cannot let pass without comment. One of our passengers experienced treatment from a crew member that fell far short of the standards we expect and claim to represent. Several of you witnessed it, and some of you bravely spoke up when it would have been easier and more comfortable to stay silent. I want to thank those passengers who stood up for what was right, who chose to be allies and advocates. It would have been easier to stay silent, to mind your own business, to tell yourself it wasn't your problem or that you might be misreading the situation. But you chose to be witnesses, to use your voices and whatever privilege you have to defend someone who is being mistreated. That's what it actually takes to create change, not just good intentions, but active intervention. This airline will be conducting a full investigation into what happened today, and there will be real accountability. To the passenger who was affected, I apologize personally and professionally. You deserve better from us, and I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure we deliver better going forward. The cabin was silent when she finished, passengers processing her words and their implications. Then, slowly, tentatively, passengers began to applaud. It started with Patricia, her hands coming together firmly, then spread to the attorney, then to the young woman who had recorded video, then through the entire cabin in a wave of sound. They weren't applauding the airline or excusing what had happened. They were applauding the accountability, the acknowledgement that something wrong had occurred, the promise that it mattered and would be addressed rather than minimized or dismissed. Marcus sat quietly in his seat, his eyes closed, letting the moment wash over him with all its complexity. It didn't erase the exhaustion of constantly having to prove his humanity, didn't undo the hours of subtle hostility and disrespect he had endured, didn't guarantee it wouldn't happen again on his next flight or the one after that. But it was something. It was witnesses who spoke up instead of looking away and pretending not to see. It was a captain who listened to passengers instead of automatically siding with a crew member. It was strangers who chose to care about injustice even when it didn't directly affect them. It was imperfect, incomplete accountability, but it was more than he usually got, more than most people in his position ever received. When the plane landed smoothly on Seattle's runway and taxied to the gate, Sarah was escorted off by airline supervisors in dark suits before general boarding was allowed to deplane, a clear sign that the situation was being taken seriously at a management level. Marcus watched her walk to the jet bridge flanked by officials, her uniform still perfect but her posture defeated and diminished, and he felt an unexpected flash of something that wasn't quite pity but wasn't satisfaction either. She had let her biases destroy her career in a single shift, had made choices that would follow her professionally for years. She had looked at him and seen only skin color, had missed every opportunity to course correct when her assumptions were challenged, had chosen defensiveness and doubling down over simple human decency and professional behavior. She had done it to herself through her own choices and actions, but the system that taught her those biases from childhood, that reinforced them through media and culture, that made her feel safe acting on them for 12 years without apparent consequence, that system bore responsibility too. Individual accountability mattered, but it couldn't be the only answer to systemic problems. Patricia walked with Marcus through the airport, even though her connection was in a different terminal entirely, insisting on making sure he was all right and offering continued support. I know you probably hear this a lot, and it might not mean much, but you handled that with such grace and composure, she said as they walked past shops and restaurants. I don't know if I could have stayed that calm if someone was treating me that way. Marcus gave her a sad smile that carried decades of learned behavior. You learn early that showing anger, even justified anger, just confirms their stereotypes about aggressive black men. You learn to be twice as calm, twice as polite, twice as professional as anyone else, because anything less will be used against you as evidence that you're the problem. It's exhausting, but it's survival. It's what you have to do to make it through. It shouldn't have to be that way, Patricia said fiercely, her voice rising with emotion. It's not fair that the burden is always on the people experiencing discrimination to respond perfectly, to be twice as good, to control their completely justified reactions while the people discriminating against them face no expectations at all. No, it's not fair at all, Marcus agreed quietly. But thank you for speaking up today. That matters more than you know. A lot of people see discrimination happening in real time and convince themselves they're misreading the situation, or it's not their place to get involved, or maybe somehow the person being discriminated against did something to deserve it. You didn't do that. You saw it clearly. You named it for what it was, and you supported a stranger at some social risk to yourself. That's how change actually happens, one intervention at a time. They exchanged contact information before going their separate ways to their respective destinations. Patricia to her daughter's house in Olympia and Marcus to his hotel downtown. Patricia promised to write a detailed statement for his complaint, including specific times and descriptions of each interaction she had witnessed. She would keep that promise faithfully, as would the attorney David Rosen, the young woman with the video whose name was Jessica Chun, and 4 other passengers who had witnessed the interactions and felt compelled to document what they had seen. Their statements, detailed and consistent and damning, would form the basis of an investigation that would ultimately result in Sarah Mitchell's termination from the airline and mandatory implicit bias training for the airline's entire cabin crew staff across all hubs. Marcus made it to his hotel that evening after a taxi ride through Seattle traffic, checked it mechanically, and sat on the bed in his bland corporate hotel room, still processing everything that had happened in the 6 hours since he had boarded that plane. He pulled out his laptop and began typing his incident report for the airline, a task made simultaneously easier and more emotionally draining by the multiple witness statements already being sent to his email inbox. Each one provided corroboration, specific details he hadn't noticed himself, timestamps and descriptions that would make his complaint impossible to dismiss or minimize. His phone buzzed with a text from Captain Walsh. She had officially filed a report as the pilot in command and wanted him to know that the airline was taking the matter seriously at the highest levels, that the CEO had already been briefed, that there would be real consequences and not just empty promises. She included her personal email address and an invitation to connect if he ever wanted to discuss aviation matters or just needed someone who understood what it was like to navigate this industry while black, someone who had fought similar battles and could offer perspective or support. He replied with sincere thanks, then sat back against the headboard, loosening his tie and letting the exhaustion wash over him fully now that he was alone and didn't have to maintain his composure. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, not just a flight from Atlanta, but the entire life path that had led to this moment. He thought about being a young black boy growing up in rural Georgia, in a small town where opportunities felt limited and dreams felt dangerous, who had looked up at planes overhead and dreamed of flying them despite everyone telling him to be more realistic. He thought about his parents, his father who worked 2 jobs to keep the family afloat, and his mother who cleaned houses for wealthy white families, scraping together money for flight lessons when he was 16, because they believed in his dreams even when those dreams seemed impossible. He thought about instructors who had seen his potential and nurtured it, who had stayed late to give him extra training without charging extra fees, who had written recommendation letters that opened doors. And he thought about the other instructors who had doubted him at every step, who had held him to higher standards than white students, who had failed him on tests he had passed, who had told him directly that aviation wasn't for people like him. He thought about being one of only 3 black pilots in his entire training class of 47 students, about the isolation of being constantly other in every room he entered. He thought about the surprise in passengers' voices when he greeted them from the cockpit during his commercial flying days, the double takes when he walked through the terminal in uniform, the passengers who had requested different flights upon seeing him in the captain's seat. He thought about the airport security checks that always seemed more thorough when he was in uniform, the additional questions and the lingering examinations of the credentials, the underlying assumption that he didn't belong in that uniform until he proved otherwise. He thought about choosing to leave commercial flying for the FAA because he wanted to make the system better from the inside, wanted to ensure that regulations protected everyone equally, wanted his work to create smoother skies and safer conditions for the pilots who would come after him, especially those who looked like him and would face the same barriers he had encountered. And he thought about Sarah Mitchell, who had looked at him and seen none of that history, none of that achievement, none of that dedication, who had seen only her own prejudices and fears reflected back at her own assumptions about what a black man in a hoodie represented, who had paid the price for her bias. Yes, losing her career and her professional reputation in a single day, but who was also a product of a society that taught her those biases in 1,000 subtle ways from childhood onward. He didn't forgive her actions or excuse her behavior, but he understood that individual accountability was only part of the equation, necessary but not sufficient. Systems had to change fundamentally. Training had to improve beyond simple diversity checklists. Consequences had to be real and consistent, not just applied in high-profile cases that went viral. And people, everyday passengers like Patricia and David and Jessica, they had to keep choosing to speak up even when it was uncomfortable, even when it would be easier to look away, even when it meant risking confrontation or social awkwardness. 3 months later, after his Seattle audit was complete, and he had returned to his home office in Atlanta, Marcus received a formal apology letter from the airline CEO. It wasn't a form letter or a generic corporate response. It was 3 pages long, personally signed, acknowledging specifically what had happened to him and taking institutional responsibility for the culture that had allowed it to happen. It came with a substantial compensation package that went beyond the standard flight refund, acknowledging both the discrimination he had experienced and the emotional toll it had taken. And it came with an invitation to consult on their new comprehensive diversity and inclusion training program for cabin crew, helping to develop curriculum and scenarios that would challenge implicit bias and create real accountability. Sarah Mitchell had been terminated, though the airline couldn't share specific details of her case with him due to privacy laws and employment regulations. The FAA audit he conducted in Seattle resulted in 3 formal safety citations and 12 detailed recommendations for improvement, work that would directly impact procedures and make flying safer for millions of passengers over the coming years. The video taken by Jessica Chun had gone viral within 48 hours of her posting it, accumulating millions of views and sparking broader conversations about discrimination in air travel and the aviation industry more generally. News outlets picked up the story. Aviation blog dissected it. Social media erupted with personal stories from other passengers who had experienced similar treatment. The pressure from public attention led to policy changes at multiple airlines, not just Delta but competitors who suddenly wanted to demonstrate they were better at addressing bias. Task forces were formed. Training programs were enhanced. Reporting mechanisms were strengthened, though Marcus remained cautiously skeptical about whether these changes would prove substantive or merely performative over time. Patricia kept in touch consistently, becoming more than just a witness to his experience but a genuine friend. They became 2 people from different generations and backgrounds connected by a single moment of choosing what was right over what was comfortable, of choosing intervention over passivity. They met for coffee when he traveled to Portland for work, exchanged emails about books and current events, talked on the phone about everything from aviation policy to family struggles. She told him that speaking up on that flight had inspired her to become more active in anti-racism work in her retirement, reigniting commitments she had made in her youth, but had let fade during the busy middle years of career and family. She was leading workshops at her former school district, consulting with teachers on recognizing and interrupting bias in their classrooms, using her voice and her privilege in ways she hadn't done consistently since the 1960s. One moment of courage on that flight had rekindled a lifetime commitment, had reminded her that bearing witness wasn't enough without action, that good intentions meant nothing without follow-through. The attorney, David Rosen, did end up working with Marcus, not on his individual case, which settled to the airline's internal process, but on a broader civil rights lawsuit against another airline with an even worse documented track record of discrimination. David told Marcus over lunch one day that witnessing what happened on that flight reminded him why he had gone into civil rights law in the first place, had reignited a passion that years of bureaucracy and compromise and dealing with corporate attorneys had dimmed. He had been going through the motions, handling cases, but not feeling connected to the mission anymore. Seeing Marcus handle that situation with such dignity, seeing the other passengers rally to support him, seeing justice actually happen even imperfectly, it reminded David why the work mattered, why every case represented a human being deserving of dignity and equal treatment. And Marcus continued his work at the FAA, continued to audit and inspect and recommend and improve, continued to fly occasionally for the sheer joy of it in small planes on clear days, continued to navigate professional and personal spaces where he was often the only black face in the room. The incident on Flight 1847 didn't end racism in aviation or anywhere else. It didn't prevent other passengers from experiencing discrimination on other flights with other crew members. It didn't mean Marcus himself wouldn't face bias again, because he absolutely would and did. Within 6 months, he experienced a similar situation on a different airline, though that time the flight attendant backed down more quickly when challenged, perhaps because stories like his had circulated widely enough to create some deterrent effect, however small. But Flight 1847 was a data point in the larger struggle. It was proof that accountability was possible when systems worked correctly, when people spoke up, when consequences followed actions. It was an example of what happens when people choose to be witnesses rather than bystanders, when they choose to believe someone's experience rather than dismiss it, when they choose solidarity over comfort and intervention over passivity. It was a reminder that sometimes the person you underestimate, dismiss, or discriminate against might be exactly the person who has the power to hold you accountable. Though Marcus wished people treated everyone with dignity regardless of their credentials or status. It was a lesson that seeing people's humanity instead of their stereotypes isn't just morally right, though it certainly is that, but it's also practically wise because you never know who people really are until you take the time to see them as complex human beings first. Most importantly, it was a story that spread beyond the immediate parties involved, that got told and retold, that circulated through social media and news outlets and training sessions and family dinner conversations. It made some flight attendants check their biases and examine their own behavior patterns, recognizing themselves in Sarah's actions and choosing to do better. It made some passengers commit to speaking up the next time they witnessed discrimination, having seen that intervention could make a real difference. It made some airline executives realize that training had to change fundamentally and policies had to be enforced consistently, that diversity statements meant nothing without accountability mechanisms. It rippled outward in ways large and small, creating tiny shifts in awareness and behavior that accumulated into something larger over time. Each small change contributing to incremental progress, even as massive obstacles remained. The story reached flight attendant training programs at multiple airlines, becoming a case study in what not to do, in how implicit bias affects behavior, in the importance of treating every passenger with equal dignity regardless of appearance or assumptions. It reached aviation schools where future pilots discussed it in their crew resource management classes, examining how Captain Walsh handled the situation and what they could learn from her leadership. It reached diversity and inclusion workshops in corporations far beyond the airline industry, becoming an example of everyday discrimination and the power of bystander intervention. Each telling reached new audiences, sparked new conversations, challenged new people to examine their own biases and their own willingness to speak up when witnessing injustice. If you made it to the end of this story, take a moment to think seriously and honestly about what you would have done in that cabin on Flight 1847. Would you have spoken up like Patricia did? risking confrontation and social awkwardness to defend a stranger? Would you have recorded evidence like Jessica, making yourself visible and potentially becoming a target yourself? Would you have offered your professional support like David, using your privilege and credentials to amplify someone else's voice? Or would you have looked away, convincing yourself it wasn't your business, that you were probably misreading the situation, that surely there was some explanation that made it less clear-cut than it appeared? There's no judgment here in asking these questions. Just an invitation to honesty with yourself about your own responses to injustice. Because the next time you witness discrimination, and there will be a next time, because these incidents happen constantly in countless contexts, the next time you see someone being treated differently because of their race or gender or religion or sexual orientation, or any other aspect of their identity, you'll have a choice to make in that moment. You can be Sarah, letting your biases guide your actions and finding justifications for differential treatment. You could be a silent passenger, watching but not intervening, bearing witness but not speaking up, telling yourself it's not your place or not your problem. Or you can be Patricia, David, Jessica, and the other passengers who saw wrong and refused to let it pass unchallenged, who made themselves uncomfortable to defend someone else's dignity. The story of Flight 1847 isn't really about a single flight attendant who discriminated against a black passenger, though that certainly happened. It's about systems of bias that operate every single day in every industry and institution and community, often invisibly to those who benefit from them. It's about the cost of discrimination to those who experience it directly and repeatedly, the exhaustion of constantly having to prove your humanity and worth, and the cost of those who perpetrate it, who diminish themselves morally and often practically by acting on their biases. It's about the power of witnesses who choose to see clearly and speak honestly, who refuse to let injustice happen in silence, who use whatever privilege or platform they have to support those being harmed. It's about accountability that actually means something, that goes beyond apologies to real consequences and real changes in policies and practices. And it's about the reality that you never know who people really are, what they've accomplished, what they carry inside them, until you take the time to see them as full human beings rather than stereotypes or assumptions. Marcus Thompson never asked for attention or recognition or his story to go viral. He just wanted to fly to Seattle, do his job with the competence he had built over years of hard work, and be treated with basic human dignity. The fact that even that simple expectation was too much for one flight attendant to provide says everything about how far we still have to go as society in eliminating bias and discrimination. But the fact that passengers spoke up vocally and consistently, that a captain listened and took action, that consequences followed, and weren't just empty threats, and that changes resulted at multiple airlines gives us a map for the journey ahead, imperfect but real. We get there one choice at a time, one voice at a time, one moment of courage at a time, one person deciding that another person's dignity matters enough to risk discomfort or confrontation. The destination of true equality and justice remains distant, but the path runs through moments exactly like the ones on Flight 1847, where ordinary people make choices that collectively bend the arc towards something better.